In February 1945, the island of Iwo Jima rose out of the Pacific like a fortress carved from volcanic ash and hardened resolve. Barely 8 square miles in size, it carried an importance far greater than its modest geography suggested. To the American High Command, it was the stepping stone needed for B-29 bombers to strike directly at the Japanese homeland, and for crippled aircraft returning from raids over Tokyo to find a safe haven to land. To the Japanese defenders, commanded by the brilliant and unyielding General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, it was sacred ground, the last shield before the home islands themselves. The battle that erupted there was not just another clash in the Pacific. It was the collision of two nations' final gambits, one side seeking a decisive foothold, the other determined to resist until annihilation. The Marines who hit the black volcanic beaches on February 19th expected horror, but even their hardened imaginations had not prepared them for the ferocity of what awaited. The Japanese had abandoned futile banzai charges, and instead turned the island into a honeycomb of death. 11 miles of tunnels connected pillboxes, bunkers, and caves. Artillery and machine guns were concealed, firing in deadly cross patterns. Each emplacement was designed not merely to resist, but to consume lives, to delay the inevitable by inflicting unbearable cost. For days, the Americans hammered the island with naval gunfire and aerial bombardment, believing nothing could survive such devastation. Yet when the Marines pushed inland, the volcano erupted, not with lava, but with lead, fire, and shrapnel. Thousands fell in the first hours, and still the defenders endured. By the time the Marines reached the vicinity of Airfield No. 1, the battle had already taken on the character of a siege. Progress was measured in yards, not miles, each gain drenched in blood. The pillboxes guarding the airfield were among the most formidable on the island, reinforced with concrete, hidden by volcanic ash, and perfectly sited to interlock fields of fire. Machine gun bursts cut down anyone who dared advance in the open. Mortar rounds fell with relentless precision. Tanks sent forward in support were trapped and destroyed by hidden artillery or mines. Engineers tried to blast openings with demolition charges, only to be gunned down before they could place them. Hour after hour, day after day, the Marines threw themselves against this wall of stone and steel, and the wall held firm. It was here, in this crucible of fire, that a young Marine corporal named Hershel Woody Williams found himself. He was not an imposing figure. Standing just 5 feet 6 inches tall, he looked almost boyish compared to the grizzled veterans around him. Born on a dairy farm in West Virginia, Williams had grown up working hard, riding horses, and helping his family make ends meet during the Depression. He had tried to enlist in the Marine Corps in 1942, but was turned away for being too short. By 1943, as casualties mounted, the standards changed, and Woody finally got his chance to wear the uniform. He was quiet, modest, and unassuming, but beneath that humble exterior burned a sense of duty as fierce as any fire he would one day unleash. On February 23rd, the fighting around Airfield No. 1 had reached a deadlock. The 21st Marines had attacked repeatedly, only to be driven back with staggering losses. One company reported nearly 40% casualties in a single morning. The survivors were exhausted, their nerves frayed, their strength ebbing. Morale was slipping. The thought that these bunkers might be truly impregnable gnawed at every man's mind. The advance had stalled so completely that commanders feared momentum across the entire island could falter. Something had to break the stalemate, or the cost in American lives would become intolerable. The Marines possessed weapons that, in theory, could defeat the pillboxes, flamethrowers, and demolition charges. But in practice, using them meant almost certain death. Flamethrower operators were prime targets. Their bulky tanks marked them out instantly, and a single bullet or fragment could ignite the fuel, turning the man into a living torch. Few lasted long in combat, yet without them the bunkers would never fall. The choice was as cruel as the battlefield itself: send men forward to near certain death, or remain pinned down under relentless fire. It was in this grim moment that Woody Williams stepped forward. He had been trained as a demolition man, familiar with flamethrowers but not assigned to carry one regularly. As the Marines huddled behind meager cover, pinned by gunfire and unsure how to proceed, Williams volunteered. He would take a flamethrower and try to knock out the pillboxes himself. It was an act that stunned those around him, not because anyone doubted his courage, but because the odds of surviving such a mission were almost non-existent. Some later described it as a suicide assignment. Yet Woody did not hesitate. Perhaps it was his farm upbringing, where tasks were undertaken without complaint because they simply had to be done. Perhaps it was his loyalty to the men beside him, comrades who had bled and died together since landing on the island. Perhaps it was the simple conviction that if someone did not try, they would all perish anyway. Whatever the reason, Williams picked up the heavy M22 flamethrower, strapped the 70-pound apparatus to his small frame, and prepared to advance. His fellow Marines watched in a mixture of awe and dread, knowing they might never see him alive again. The air was thick with the acrid stench of cordite and sulfur, mingled with the sickly sweet odor of volcanic ash scorched by explosions. Machine guns chattered from hidden slits, their tracers stitching deadly lines across the black ground. Mortars thumped, shells shrieked overhead, and the island seemed to shudder with every detonation. Into this maelstrom, Williams crawled. He did not charge recklessly, but moved with deliberate patience, hugging the earth, inching forward whenever a lull in fire permitted. His comrades laid down covering fire, desperately trying to keep enemy gunners' heads down. Every movement was a gamble. Every yard gained was paid for with the risk of sudden, violent death. As he moved closer to the first pillbox, the full enormity of the task pressed in. The bunker loomed like a monolith, its dark embrasures spitting fire. The walls were scarred but intact, impervious to rifle and machine gun fire. The only way to neutralize it was to get close enough to unleash the flamethrower directly into its apertures, to burn the oxygen from within and force the defenders out, or incinerate them where they crouched. It was a form of combat, as primitive as it was terrifying, pitting man against stone, fire against flesh. Williams waited for the right moment, heart hammering in his chest, sweat mingling with volcanic grit on his face. Then, with a sudden surge of resolve, he rose just high enough to squeeze the trigger. A jet of flaming liquid roared from the nozzle, hissing as it struck the bunker's opening. The fire clung, seeped, and consumed. Screams erupted from inside, muffled but unmistakable. For the first time in days, Marines watching from behind saw the impossible happen. One of the dreaded pillboxes had fallen silent. The effect was electric. A cheer rose above the din of battle, not of triumph, but of renewed hope. The line had bent, and for the first time, the men dared to believe it might break. Williams did not pause to savor the moment. He knew there were more bunkers ahead, each one bristling with death. He knew his fuel was limited, his chances slender. Yet he pressed on, dragging the heavy flamethrower across the ash, determined to strike again and again until either the enemy was broken or he was. At that moment, Hershel Woody Williams ceased to be just another Marine in the chaos of Iwo Jima. He became the spear point of the assault, the man who had taken upon himself a mission most considered impossible. The outcome was uncertain, the cost potentially final, but the act itself was already legendary. In a battlefield defined by collective sacrifice, the courage of one small man with a flamethrower was about to change the fate of many. Williams advanced with the flamethrower strapped to his back, the metal tanks digging into his shoulders, the hose and nozzle clumsy in his hands. Every step forward felt like stepping into the maw of death, but there was no turning back. The Japanese gunners knew what he carried, and they focused their fury upon him. Bullets tore through the air, snapping overhead, kicking up plumes of volcanic ash around his crawling body. A mortar exploded nearby, the shockwave rattling his teeth, the heat of shrapnel licking across his cheek. Somehow none of it struck home. Marines watching later swore that luck, providence, or perhaps sheer willpower shielded him, but Woody himself never claimed any such thing. He simply kept moving, because stopping meant failure, and failure meant more of his brothers would die. The first pillbox had fallen, but it was only one of many. To his left and right, bunkers still poured fire into the American lines. Each was built to support the others. Silence one, and another would cover its flank. Williams understood instinctively that he had to break not just a single strong point, but a chain of them, to unravel the interlocking fields of fire that had stalled the Marines for days. He did not have the luxury of strategy sessions or detailed plans, only the raw instinct of survival and the cold determination to finish what he had begun. With a hand signal, he directed 2 riflemen forward. They were his lifeline, tasked with picking off enemy snipers or gunners who might spot him in the open. The bond between them was wordless, forged in the crucible of battle. They knew his task was impossible without their cover. He knew they were risking themselves to give him a chance. Together, this tiny team crawled across the ashen battlefield, inch by inch, toward the next bunker. Williams paused in a shallow crater, panting, the weight of the flamethrower pressing him into the earth. He checked the pressure gauge, counted his fuel bursts. He had only seconds of fire with each tank, and he could not waste them. Then he crept forward again. The second pillbox loomed, its slit spewing bursts of machine gun fire that hammered the ground in staccato rhythm. He waited, timing the bursts, then surged up to unleash his weapon. A torrent of fire gushed from the nozzle, a living stream that curled into the embrasure. Flames licked inside, followed by screams and the sound of ammunition cooking off in a crackling chain reaction. The machine gun fell silent. Another strong point had been erased. Again he withdrew to refill his tanks. The supply point was behind the Marine lines, and every trip back was as dangerous as the advance itself. Enemy gunners recognized the significance of the man with the flamethrower and concentrated their fire upon him whenever he appeared. Each return felt like tempting fate anew, as if the odds of survival shrank with every journey. Yet Williams emerged each time, burdened once more, ready to crawl forward again. The third target was more cunningly placed, its opening concealed, its defenders alert. As Williams crawled closer, a shot rang out, striking the nozzle of his flamethrower and denting the metal. Another bullet hissed past his ear. He flattened himself, heart pounding, realizing how narrowly he had escaped immolation. He could smell the gasoline-like odor of fuel leaking faintly, a warning that one more hit might ignite the tanks on his back. Still, he pressed forward, shifting his approach angle to avoid the bunker's direct line of sight. Then came a stroke of improvisation. The flamethrower was nearly empty, its last dregs sloshing in the tanks. Williams eyed the tank support Sherman nearby, its cannon firing intermittently at distant caves. An idea seized him. Crawling to the tank, he rapped on its hull, shouting for attention. When the driver opened the hatch, Woody motioned frantically, pointing toward the pillbox. The tank lumbered forward, its treads grinding volcanic rock, and unleashed a shell that smashed into the bunker's face. The concrete cracked, but did not collapse. At that moment, Williams rushed forward, unleashing his remaining fire into the fissures. The flames roared through the cracks, reaching the defenders within. Smoke belched out, and then silence. The combination of steel and fire had done the work. 3 pillboxes had fallen, and still he was not finished. The Marines were astonished. No one had ever expected him to last this long, let alone to keep returning for more. Every time he came back for fresh fuel, sweat-soaked and ash-streaked, they thought it would be the last time they saw him. And every time he reappeared, dragging that monstrous weapon into the storm, their spirits lifted. His courage was infectious. If one small man could face down the Japanese fortress, perhaps they could too. The hours blurred together, measured only in the rhythm of advance, fire, withdrawal, and return. The sun crept across the sky, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The ash turned sticky with blood, the air foul with the smell of charred earth and scorched flesh. Williams moved like a man possessed, not reckless but utterly committed, his mind narrowed to the single purpose of silencing one bunker after another. At the fourth strong point, defenders tried a desperate tactic. As Williams approached, a Japanese soldier suddenly leapt from a hidden exit, charging him with bayonet fixed. Woody spun, barely in time, and squeezed the trigger. The jet of flame engulfed the attacker, halting him mid-stride in a ghastly instant. Williams turned back to the pillbox and sent another blast into its dark mouth. When the fire died, the bunker was silent, its defenders either dead or fled into the tunnels. By now his uniform was singed, his hands blistered, his body exhausted from the endless cycle of crawling, firing, and dragging the heavy tanks. Yet adrenaline kept him moving, sustained by the knowledge that each pillbox destroyed meant dozens of Marines spared. The fifth emplacement required even greater daring. Its main opening was angled to resist frontal attack, so Williams crawled around its flank, exposed to sniper fire. He found a vent pipe, small but open, meant to provide air for the defenders inside. With precise aim, he thrust the nozzle into the pipe and triggered a short burst. Flames whooshed down the channel, turning the bunker into an oven. Smoke and screams burst forth, then nothing. It was a moment of brutal ingenuity, exploiting the very design features that made the bunkers so formidable. Hours had passed. For the Marines pinned behind the lines, it felt like watching a myth unfold in real time. One man, again and again, rising from the ash to deliver fire upon the impregnable, returning each time when all expected he would not. Whether it was 3, 5, or 7 pillboxes in total, the accounts would vary. The essence was undeniable. Williams had shattered the chain of defenses that had held them fast. By late afternoon, Williams stumbled back from his final run. The flamethrower tanks were empty, his strength nearly gone. His face was blackened with soot, his uniform scorched, his body trembling from exertion. Yet when he collapsed into cover among his comrades, the battlefield had changed. The airfield's defensive ring was broken. The Marines surged forward, advancing nearly 300 yards in the span of 2 hours, more than they had gained in the previous 3 days combined. The stalemate was over, and it was Woody Williams who had tipped the scales. The cost of those hours weighed heavily. Williams had witnessed horrors no man should endure, the screams of men burning, the sight of enemies consumed by fire, the constant awareness that he himself might meet the same fate. It was not glory he felt, but numbness, a hollow exhaustion that settled deep within his bones. Yet to the Marines who followed in his wake, he was a savior, the man who had faced down the impossible and lived. Even then, Williams did not think of himself as a hero. He had done what had to be done, nothing more. But the truth was clear. On that day, in those 4 hours, his courage had altered the course of the battle for Airfield No. 1 and perhaps saved hundreds of American lives. When Woody Williams finally dropped the spent flamethrower from his blistered shoulders and slumped into the ash among his comrades, the battlefield seemed eerily changed. The roar of machine guns had diminished, the relentless hammering of mortars slackened, and for the first time in days, the Marines at Airfield No. 1 looked across ground that was no longer dominated by Japanese fire. The pillboxes that had stood like invincible sentinels were now smoking husks, their once lethal apertures silent. The air smelled of scorched concrete, fuel, and burned flesh, a nauseating mixture that clung to uniforms and lungs alike. Yet beneath the stench lay something more profound, the realization that the stalemate had been broken. The order to advance rippled down the line. At first the Marines hesitated, disbelieving that the enemy fire had truly ceased, fearing a trap. But as Williams lay gasping, covered in grime and sweat, they began to rise. Squads pushed forward cautiously, then with growing confidence. They passed the still warm wreckage of the pillboxes, glancing at the blackened interiors, grim reminders of the price of progress. And then, as they pressed beyond, they found the field ahead open. In 2 hours, the regiment gained 300 yards, more ground than they had managed in 3 blood-soaked days. For the Marines who had endured the suffocating deadlock, the sight of progress was a revelation. Men who had felt the weight of despair lift from their shoulders now surged forward with renewed energy. They knew they had been spared further slaughter by the actions of one small corporal who had crawled into the jaws of death and emerged alive. In whispered tones, they spoke of Williams as if he were already a legend. Some called him lucky, others fearless, but all agreed that without him they might still be pinned in the ash, dying by inches. Williams, however, felt no triumph. As he staggered back to the rear to rest and receive water, his body trembled uncontrollably. His hands, raw from gripping the hot metal of the flamethrower, barely held the canteen thrust at him. His throat was parched, his lungs scorched by the acrid fumes of his own weapon. And in his mind, images replayed endlessly, the faces of men bursting from pillboxes only to be engulfed, the screams echoing from within sealed chambers, the sickening sound of bodies consumed by fire. He had accomplished the mission, yes, but at a cost that he would carry far longer than the battle itself. Night fell over Iwo Jima, the horizon glowing with the constant bombardment of artillery and naval guns. The island never truly slept. Yet in the American positions near Airfield No. 1, there was a sense that a corner had been turned. The chain of pillboxes once thought impregnable had been broken, and the Marines pressed their advantage, digging in deeper and preparing to push further inland. Williams lay among them, finally allowing exhaustion to claim him, though sleep brought no peace. Each time his eyes closed, he saw fire again, heard the muffled shrieks from the bunkers, felt the searing weight of the flamethrower on his back. In the days that followed, his reputation spread through the battalion. Commanders spoke of his courage, of the 4-hour ordeal that had turned the tide. Fellow Marines slapped his shoulder, offered cigarettes, and told him he had saved their lives. But Williams himself avoided the spotlight. He deflected praise, insisting that he had only done what anyone else would have done, that it was the riflemen covering him, or the tank crew supporting him, who deserved equal credit. His modesty only deepened the admiration others felt for him. In a place where death was constant, and heroes often fell before anyone could honor them, the sight of one who had lived through such odds was almost miraculous. The tactical significance of his actions was undeniable. By neutralizing the bunkers, Williams had enabled the Marines to secure Airfield No. 1, a key objective on the island. From there, they could expand their hold, bringing in supplies and pushing further north. Each yard gained brought them closer to Mount Suribachi in the south and the labyrinth of caves in the north. The victory was not complete. Indeed, some of the fiercest fighting still lay ahead, but the momentum had shifted. Williams had demonstrated that even the strongest Japanese positions could be cracked, that ingenuity and sheer will could overcome engineering and fanaticism. For the Japanese defenders, the loss of the pillboxes was a grim omen. General Kuribayashi had designed his defense to bleed the Americans white, to make every advance so costly that the invaders might reconsider the invasion of the homeland itself. Yet even he could not have foreseen the single-minded assault of a Marine armed with fire, who turned the very tunnels and vents of his bunkers into channels of destruction. To the defenders, it must have seemed as if the Americans wielded not just weapons, but elemental forces. Still they fought on, refusing to surrender, but the cracks in their fortress had begun to spread. As the battle raged across the island, Williams continued to serve with his unit, though never again did he endure such a concentrated ordeal. He returned to more ordinary duties, carrying a rifle, assisting with demolitions, always under fire, always in danger. Yet those 4 hours defined him in the eyes of his comrades and commanders alike. Stories circulated, growing with each retelling, until the number of pillboxes he had destroyed became almost mythical. Some said 3, others 5, still others 7. Williams himself never counted. He had neither the time nor the desire to keep score. For him, it was enough that the Marines had moved forward, that fewer of his friends had died that day. In quieter moments, he wrestled with the morality of what he had done. Flamethrowers were among the most feared weapons of the war, inflicting not just death but terror. The men who carried them were often despised by the enemy, targeted for immediate elimination. Williams knew why. He had seen what fire did to human flesh, heard the inhuman screams of men trapped in bunkers as the flames poured in. He took no pride in those memories. They were not tales to boast of, but burdens to bear. More than once he confided to others that he had burned enough people for a lifetime. And yet, amid the torment, there was also relief. The Marines who shook his hand, who clapped him on the back and called him Woody, were alive because of his actions. They would go home, see their families again, build lives beyond the war. In that knowledge lay a measure of comfort, even if it could never erase the horrors themselves. As the American flag was raised over Mount Suribachi days later, immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's iconic photograph, Williams was elsewhere on the island, still doing his duty. He did not see the moment, though he later understood its power. To him, the true victory was not in symbols or headlines, but in the steady grinding progress that carried the Marines across Iwo Jima, one bunker, one cave, 1 yard of volcanic ash at a time. His own part in that progress was small in scale but vast in impact, a reminder that sometimes the fate of many can hinge on the resolve of one. By the time the island was secured after 36 brutal days, nearly 7,000 Marines lay dead and 20,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison had been annihilated, almost to the last man. Iwo Jima was an American possession, but the price had been staggering. Williams walked away from the island alive, though forever changed. He was no longer the quiet farm boy from West Virginia. He was a survivor of one of the fiercest battles of the war, a man who had stared into the inferno and carried its memory with him. For now, the war was not yet over. Ahead lay Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of all, and beyond that, the planned invasion of Japan itself. But for Hershel Woody Williams, the 4 hours at Airfield No. 1 would always stand apart, a crucible that tested the limits of human courage and endurance. Others would call him a hero, shower him with honors, write his name into history. He himself would never fully accept those titles. In his heart, he remained a Marine who had simply done his job, because it was what the moment demanded, and because the men beside him deserved nothing less. By the time the afternoon sun began its slow descent over Iwo Jima on February 23, 1945, the landscape had already been transformed into something beyond imagination. A mixture of blasted rock-burning earth and the remnants of once impregnable Japanese defenses now reduced to silence. Hershel Woody Williams staggered back toward his company's lines, his uniform scorched and torn, his body caked with ash and sulfur dust, his face nearly unrecognizable beneath a mask of exhaustion. Yet in his wake, a path of destruction stretched across the battlefield, and with it, a new possibility had opened for the Marines who had been pinned down for days. For 3 days straight, the Marines of the 21st Regiment had clawed for every foot of ground in northern Iwo Jima, advancing only a few yards at a time before being halted by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Tanks had been disabled, engineers cut down, and entire platoons shredded before they could even approach the hardened pillboxes. The psychological toll was enormous. Men huddled in shell holes whispered about the island being impossible, about the Japanese never dying, about the futility of trying to dig them out. But Williams's assault had changed something fundamental. His relentless 4-hour rampage with the flamethrower had not only eliminated some of the most stubborn strongpoints, it had also broken the aura of invincibility that surrounded the Japanese defenses. As Williams collapsed into the arms of his comrades, too weak even to speak, officers quickly realized what his success meant. They had been searching desperately for a tactical solution to a seemingly unsolvable problem. Now they had one. Flamethrower teams supported by tanks could crack the Japanese network, one strong point at a time. It was not quick, it was not easy, and it was horrifyingly dangerous, but it was possible. The orders went out almost immediately. While Williams was dragged back for rest and treatment, other Marines were instructed to replicate the method he had pioneered in blood and fire. Tanks rolled forward again, now with infantry hugging their sides for cover. Flamethrower operators, once thought of as carrying little more than suicide devices, suddenly became the spearhead of the assault. Engineers carrying satchel charges followed close behind, ready to collapse bunkers once the defenders inside had been driven out by fire. The effect was dramatic. Within 2 hours of Williams's withdrawal, the 21st Marines advanced nearly 300 yards, an astonishing gain compared to the 3 previous days of grinding stalemate. The men surged forward with a new sense of momentum, emboldened by the sight of Japanese fortifications actually falling. Even when new pillboxes spat fire at them, the Marines no longer saw them as unbreakable obstacles, but as targets that could be destroyed with enough persistence and teamwork. The Japanese defenders, too, felt the shift. For weeks, they had watched American bombardments crash uselessly against their concrete walls, confident that their underground labyrinth would hold. But now fire was pouring into their chambers, igniting ammunition, suffocating soldiers in their own strongholds. Some tried to fight to the last bullet. Others attempted desperate banzai charges into the advancing Americans. But the psychological effect of flamethrowers was devastating. Few weapons in war evoke such primal terror. The roar of pressurized flame, the sudden billowing clouds of burning fuel, the searing heat that seemed to consume the very air. These broke the will of even the most fanatical defenders. As dusk fell, the battlefield looked different. The Americans had gained ground, the Japanese lines bent backward, and for the first time optimism spread among men who only hours earlier had doubted they would survive the day. Stories of Williams' actions circulated rapidly, carried from foxhole to foxhole, often exaggerated but always inspiring. Some claimed he had single-handedly cleared an entire company's worth of pillboxes. Others swore he had been seen walking through sheets of fire unscathed, like some figure out of legend. For the tired, wounded Marines, it didn't matter if the tales were embellished. What mattered was that they now had proof. The enemy could be beaten. Behind the front, medical corpsmen tended to Williams. His body bore burns where heat had seared through his uniform. His lungs ached from inhaling smoke and fumes. His arms trembled from hours of carrying the 30-pound flamethrower. Yet he refused evacuation. He insisted on staying with his unit, knowing that morale was fragile and that his presence might encourage others to continue the fight. In truth, he felt a strange emptiness. He had done what was asked, destroyed pillboxes, silenced guns. But at what cost? Even in his haze of exhaustion, he could still smell the acrid stench of charred flesh. The screams of men engulfed in fire lingered in his memory, replaying in flashes he could not silence. For the command staff, however, there was no time to dwell on moral questions. They saw in Williams's success a blueprint for victory, and they pressed it ruthlessly. Over the next days, flamethrowers and demolitions became the cornerstone of Marine tactics on Iwo Jima. Each advance was measured not in sweeping maneuvers or grand charges, but in the systematic destruction of one pillbox after another. The island was reduced, bunker by bunker, cave by cave, with teams of men carrying fuel tanks and satchel charges at the very front of the fight. Casualties remained high, but unlike before, there was progress. The capture of Mount Suribachi on the same day, symbolized by the famous flag-raising photograph, further bolstered American morale. Yet for the men slogging through the northern sectors, it was Williams' breakthrough that felt more immediate, more personal. They could point to the ground they now held, ground that had seemed utterly unreachable before he had crawled across it with fire on his back. By the end of February 23rd, reports filtered back to higher headquarters. General Holland Smith, commander of the overall invasion, was briefed on Williams's actions. Even among the chaos of one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, his feat stood out. Commanders recognized not only the tactical importance, but the symbolic power of such heroism. It was the kind of story that could galvanize men who were otherwise being asked to throw themselves into a meat grinder. For Williams himself, there was little thought of medals or recognition. All he wanted was rest, perhaps a chance to close his eyes without seeing fire. Yet fate had already marked him. His actions on that afternoon had not only shifted the immediate battle, but also set in motion the chain of events that would eventually see him stand before President Truman later that year, receiving the Medal of Honor. But on Iwo Jima, in those critical hours after his assault, the meaning of what he had done was simpler. He had taken a mission everyone expected to be fatal, survived it, and opened the way for his comrades. In doing so, he reminded every man on that island that courage, individual, raw, and unyielding, could still change the course of a battle even in the industrialized inferno of World War II. The deadlock was broken. The Marines were moving again. And the island, though far from conquered, no longer seemed impregnable. On October 5, 1945, as autumn settled over Washington, D.C., Hershel Woody Williams found himself standing in the East Room of the White House. He wore his Marine dress uniform, pressed as sharply as the day he had first donned it, though his heart pounded harder than it ever had in combat. The war was over. Japan had surrendered 2 months earlier, and the world was breathing again after 6 years of slaughter. Yet for Williams, the battle had not ended. The echoes of Iwo Jima still stalked his thoughts, shadows he could not shake even under the golden chandeliers of the nation's capital. Before him stood President Harry S. Truman, a man who had himself been thrust from obscurity into the harsh light of history. The president extended a firm hand, then leaned in close as he presented the Medal of Honor. "I would rather have this medal," Truman told him softly, "than be president." The words struck Williams like a hammer. To the world, this was the nation's highest recognition of valor, a tribute to a young Marine who had taken a flamethrower and turned the tide of a battle. To Williams, it was something heavier, almost unbearable. He accepted the medal with humility, but in his heart, he whispered a silent truth. The men who deserved it most were buried in the black sand of Iwo Jima, and they would never stand in this room to receive anything. For years after the war, Williams wrestled with the meaning of that medal. He never displayed it proudly on his wall. In fact, he rarely spoke of it at all unless pressed. When asked about his heroism, he deflected, saying simply, "I was just doing my job. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come back." In interviews, he often admitted that the medal felt less like a reward than a responsibility, a constant reminder that he was alive when so many others were not. Survivor's guilt clung to him with relentless grip. What haunted him most was not the danger he had faced, but the weapon he had carried. The flamethrower was unlike any other armament. Rifles, grenades, even artillery. These killed quickly, sometimes at a distance. Fire, however, was intimate, merciless, and lingering. Williams knew exactly what he had done on Iwo Jima. He had poured burning fuel into pillboxes where human beings, frightened, desperate, clinging to their own duty, had screamed as they burned. "I've had enough fire for one lifetime," he later said, his voice tinged with sorrow. The memory never left him. Even decades later, he could close his eyes and smell the acrid scent of bodies consumed by flame. Like many veterans, Williams carried invisible wounds. Today we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder, but in the 1940s, there was no such language. Men were expected to come home, shake off the war, and return to normal life. Williams tried. He went back to West Virginia, married his childhood sweetheart Ruby, and started a family. He worked as a Veterans Administration counselor, dedicating himself to helping other servicemen adjust to civilian life. But beneath the surface, the war simmered. Nights were restless, memories vivid, guilt ever present. And yet, unlike some who withdrew into silence, Williams chose to transform his burden into service. He spoke often not of his own deeds, but of those who had been lost, determined that their names and sacrifices would never be forgotten. He threw himself into veterans' advocacy, fighting for better care, recognition, and support for those who had borne the cost of war. Over time, he became a powerful voice not just for Marines, but for all soldiers and their families. One cause became particularly close to his heart: the families of the fallen. Williams never forgot the young Marines who had walked behind him with rifles that day on Iwo Jima, shielding him with their lives. 2 of them had been cut down in the firestorm, dying so that he might live. Their families, like so many others across America, carried grief that never faded. Williams founded the Hershel Woody Williams Medal of Honor Foundation, dedicated to honoring Gold Star families, the parents, spouses, and children of service members who had died in war. He traveled tirelessly, raising funds, building memorials, comforting mothers and fathers who had lost everything. The small, wiry Marine from West Virginia became, in time, a towering figure in the veterans community. He was not a man who glorified combat. Rather, he spoke openly of its cost. "War is something we should avoid at all costs," he often said, "because those who fight it never truly come home." His humility and candor earned him respect far beyond military circles. He was invited to speak at schools, civic organizations, and military academies, always delivering the same message: courage and sacrifice are real, but they come with a price, and that price must never be forgotten. As decades passed, Williams watched the world change. The generation that had fought World War II slowly faded, their hair silvering, their numbers dwindling. By the 21st century, he was one of the last living links to that brutal conflict. Yet he carried himself with the same quiet dignity, never seeking fame, always seeking to honor others. When asked how he wished to be remembered, he answered not with tales of fire and blood, but with stories of kindness, service, and family. In 2022, at the age of 98, Hershel Woody Williams passed away peacefully. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from World War II. His death marked the end of an era, a closing of the book on a generation of Americans who had fought across oceans and continents to halt tyranny. But even in death, Williams's legacy endured. Across the nation, Gold Star families' memorial monuments stood as silent testaments to his vision. Thousands of veterans and families who had been touched by his compassion carried forward his example. The Medal of Honor he had once considered a burden came, at last, to symbolize something else. Not just the bravery of a young Marine in 1945, but a lifetime of service rooted in humility and compassion. Williams had redefined what it meant to be a hero. To him, it was not about destroying enemies or wearing medals. It was about honoring sacrifice, caring for the living, and ensuring the fallen were never forgotten. When his casket was carried through the streets draped in the American flag, People lined the sidewalks not simply to salute a warrior, but to pay tribute to a man who had turned pain into purpose. In the end, Woody Williams had accomplished something rarer than battlefield glory. He had found a way to transform the fire that haunted him into a light that guided others. History often remembers war in numbers. Divisions deployed, ships sunk, tons of bombs dropped, the staggering arithmetic of destruction. Iwo Jima itself is remembered as a place of statistics. 21,000 Japanese defenders, nearly all of whom died, 70,000 Marines landing on its beaches, more than 26,000 American casualties in just over a month of fighting. Yet within those numbers are individuals whose choices cannot be measured by charts or ledgers. Hershel Woody Williams was one such individual, and the meaning of his life extends far beyond the pillboxes he destroyed on that volcanic island. When we look at his story in its entirety, it becomes clear that his true legacy lies not in the violence of his actions, but in the paradox he embodied, that the same man who once carried fire into bunkers became, for the rest of his life, a voice for remembrance, compassion, and peace. The flamethrower Marine who terrorized enemies also comforted grieving families, proving that courage in war can evolve into courage in peace. The lessons begin with the moment he volunteered. Williams did not act out of recklessness or bloodlust. He acted because no one else could, because his comrades were dying and someone had to take the chance. It was not a decision of glory, but of necessity. This distinction matters. Too often we imagine battlefield heroics as acts of individual ambition. Williams himself always rejected that view. To him, the decision to pick up the flamethrower was not about proving himself, but about protecting the men beside him. The first meaning of his story is thus about duty, not to nation, not to medals, but to the faces in the foxholes next to you. The second meaning lies in the cost. Williams succeeded, but he was never free from the memory of what that success required. His survivor's guilt, his haunting memories of flame, his inability to speak of the war for years, all of these remind us that battlefield heroism is never clean. It carries scars. In honoring him, we are also reminded to honor the unseen wounds of countless veterans who came home alive but never fully left the battlefield. His life demands that we reject the simple narrative of glory and instead accept the complexity of war's human toll. The third meaning flows from what Williams did with his life after the war. Many men would have hidden from the weight of such memories. Many did. But Williams chose the harder path. He transformed his pain into purpose. His tireless work for veterans, his devotion to Gold Star families, his insistence that America remember not just its victories but its sacrifices. These became the defining achievements of his long life. The monuments he championed across the country stand not for him, but for those who never returned. In this, he reshaped the meaning of heroism itself. It is not only the courage to act in a moment of danger, but also the courage to carry memory, to comfort the grieving, to face the ghosts of war without flinching. And finally, the broader meaning of Williams' story lies in what it teaches us about the individual's power within history. World War II was an industrial conflict fought on a scale beyond imagination. Fleets of carriers, armies of millions, cities leveled by bombs. It is easy to believe that individuals were powerless amid such vast machinery. Yet Williams proves otherwise. A single Marine, 5 feet 6 inches tall, carrying 30 pounds of fuel on his back, altered the outcome of a critical sector of Iwo Jima. His 4-hour assault did not win the war, but it broke a deadlock, saved lives, and inspired momentum. In the microcosm of that battlefield, he mattered. The lesson endures. In the face of overwhelming odds, the actions of one person can still shift the tide. As the decades pass, fewer remain who remember the Pacific War firsthand. Generations grow up knowing Iwo Jima only as a chapter in a history book or an iconic photograph of a flag being raised. Yet Williams's story offers a way to keep that memory alive, not as abstract history, but as human experience. Through him, we see not just strategies and battles, but fear, courage, trauma, and redemption. Through him, we remember that war is not a clash of machines, but of men, each with a life, a conscience, and choices that echo long after the guns fall silent. In the end, perhaps the greatest meaning of his story is the way it unites opposites: fire and compassion, violence and healing, heroism and humility. Williams never glorified what he did. He saw it as a burden, something he carried on behalf of those who no longer could. Yet by carrying it, by refusing to let the weight crush him, he transformed it into a light for others. That paradox, that a man defined by flame could become a symbol of peace, is what ensures that Hershel "Woody" Williams will be remembered not just as the last Medal of Honor recipient from World War II, but as something more enduring, a reminder of both the best and the worst of what humanity can be, and the possibility of turning even the darkest fire into guiding light. And so, as history looks back on Iwo Jima, we see two images. One is the famous photograph of Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi, a symbol of triumph. The other, quieter image is of a lone Marine crawling across black sand with a flamethrower on his back, flames bursting into bunkers, clearing a path for his brothers. Both images tell the story of victory, but only one tells the story of cost. Hershel Williams carried that cost for 98 years, and in doing so, gave us a final gift: the truth that real heroism is never about firepower, but about the humanity that survives after the fire.